here to talk a bit about semantic layers and whether or not they're here to stay or just overrated hype. But before we get into it, I just want to introduce myself. So I'm Katie. I work at Lightdash, which is a BI tool that turns your DBT project into a full stack BI platform. And yeah, I kind of maybe want to talk a bit about the history of semantic layers or metrics layers, whatever you want to call them, and why I think they became such a big thing in the last 3 years. So in 2021, it felt like semantic layers were kind of popping up everywhere. And I think that in 2021, we were in a stage where the modern data stack was really well defined. You know, DBT was kind of accepted as the standard, as the transformation layer. And so we now had these standardized data transformations, writing tables into your data warehouse. But afterwards, when you wanted to aggregate those tables or join them together, this just wasn't standardized. And so it felt like almost suddenly everyone was talking about the same thing. And that same thing was, it's really hard for everyone at a company to use the same metric definitions. And the solution, it was decided by like the data community, the LinkedIn gurus, was that semantic layers were the way to solve this, or metrics layers. I'm going to use them kind of synonymously throughout this talk. And it felt like, you know, talk about the semantic layers popped up everywhere. They're on every blog post and every data person's LinkedIn. And this was all happening in 2021. And so talks about, you know, the modern data stack were being replaced by talks about semantic layer being like the next modern data stack. But before we dig into any more, I kind of want to get us all on the same page about what is a semantic layer. So I think that a semantic layer is a tool to map data logic to business logic. What I mean by that is when you talk to business users, they talk about, you know, revenue, total weekly active users. And then you talk to a data person and they go into like this crazy mode where they're like, okay, Stripe joined to like users divided by 12. So that is a semantic layer, right? You're mapping the data team's SQL logic to a business user's business logic, like total revenue. And it also provides a consistent view of data across the organization, so everyone's using the same definitions and calculations, like what is revenue? You define it once so everyone can use it. So it can be a standalone product like DBT semantic layer or Cube, or it can be a bundled product, which a lot of BI tools kind of are the bundled version of this. And the semantic layer sits between your data warehouse and the tools that business users use to consume data. So you have your data warehouse with all your raw data and your transformed data, and then you have your semantic layer, which sits in front of your integrations like BI tools, marketing tools, ops, notebook tools. And so the question is, are semantic layers here to stay, or are they just overrated hype? And I hope by the end of this that you agree with me that semantic layers are going to become a core part of the modern data stack, and that better integrations with semantic layers are what's really limiting them from taking off today. Because that's what I'm going to be talking about. So yeah, I'm going to talk about why I think they're a really important part of the modern data stack. I'm going to talk about what's missing for a universal semantic layer to really take off. And then I'm going to give you a demo of a great semantic layer integration in real life with Lightdash, of course. Had to slide it in somewhere. But yeah, I think the first bit here is why are semantic layers so important? And I think the best way of explaining why something is really important is by talking about the problems that it solves. So what are the problems that actually exist without having a semantic layer? And so the first problem that you run into, which as data people you're probably all too familiar with, is inconsistency in numbers, leading to a really big loss of trust in your data. So hopefully I don't trigger anyone here, but if I asked you the question, you know, how many active users are there? Then you're probably, as a data person, like, oh God, okay, what is active? What is user? And so this is really a problem, right? Because over time, these differences in definitions become like really simple business questions, right? And they just cause even the data team to start second guessing themselves. And so the confidence in data quality really falls across the company, and then everyone, kind of the trust in data from key decision makers ultimately breaks down, right? And so it's hard to be a data-driven organization when no one can trust the data. And the idea here is that a semantic layer allows you to have more consistencies in the numbers, leading to like more trust in the data across your organization. So that's the first big problem that a semantic layer solves. Now, the second problem I'm going to kind of lead into with a question, which is how many of you know the SQL to calculate the total profit at your company? I can tell you as a data team of one, I don't know the answer to this at my company because I just don't have the context, right? Like the CEO might have a different answer to the CTO. Someone might be including customer costs, someone might not be. And so what you end up with is you just don't have self-service because you don't know what data or metrics to use. So without a semantic layer, there's no way to build and share consistent metric definitions. And so you need a ton of context to be able to answer really simple metric questions like, what is total revenue? Like, how do we define that thing? And so data and metrics become kind of like a guessing game for everyone in the business. And instead of trying to answer their own data questions, you just end up with people going to the data team because they're like, I just don't have the context that you have. So again, semantic layers kind of solve this issue of self-service, and by self-service, I specifically am talking about like having context around metrics and dimensions to use. And I mean, I can't do a talk in 2024 without talking about LLMs. So here it is, the glorified slide. So yeah, I think LLMs need a data interface, right? People want to use LLMs in data analyses. They want to be able to build AI into their business. And really to do that and build successful AI projects, you need three things. You need data consistency, so you need accurate, consistent data. Otherwise, you'll never get the same answer to the same question, which is a problem in and of itself. You need access control, especially in really large enterprise organizations. And then, I mean, we're in the era of like TikTok, so speed is a thing. People have no attention span. If it takes too long, they're just gonna ask the data team to do it for them. So it needs to have this speed as well. And ultimately, these AI tools and LLMs need a centralized source of truth for metrics and dimensions. Otherwise, they just don't know what data to use, right? And a semantic layer offers a solution to this. So there's three really important problems that are solved by a semantic layer. We have inconsistent numbers, solved. Lack of self-service, easy. LLMs need a data interface, great. So you're probably like, okay, I'm easily going to get promoted if I just add a semantic layer to my business. Like, why are these not everywhere? Like, why is everyone not using a semantic layer if this is the three biggest problems I have and they're just solved by one tool? And I think that the thing that's really missing from semantic layers to take off is integrations. And I'm going to talk a bit first about kind of semantic layers more generally, and like they come in two flavors. So I talked about standalone semantic products like Cube or DBT semantic layer, and then there's bundled semantic products, and these tend to be BI tools. So Looker, Lightdash, SAP Business Objects, flashback for anyone out there. And with standalone semantic layers, they really rely on integrations to be adopted, right? To experience real value, they need to be integrated into tools that people are using. Otherwise, no one's using the semantic layer just for fun. And then bundled tools, they're just really tend to be built for BI. So there's not a lot of integrations across other tools, and they need more generic usage and integrations to make them work. You might have noticed a theme here, and that's we need better integrations. And so that's something easy to say. And I thought of like, I'm a product manager and a data scientist, so I put my product hat on and I was like, how would I explain this to someone if I was like, okay, you need to build the best semantic layer and it needs to be universally accepted, and you think that integrations are the best way to do it. And so I was like, okay, well, the way I think I'd think about this is by talking about requirements, or if I were to like lead a team, what requirements would I use? So I'm going to talk a bit about the requirements I would have if I were to build a universal semantic layer that's accepted by everyone and used everywhere. And the first requirement I would have is that we need metrics-first exploration for business users. And so I think the thing here that's really important is that if we want the semantic layer to be used by people outside of the data team, you need to actually think about how those people ask questions. And if you talk to a business user or just someone not in the data team and you say, like, what's total revenue? They're going to be like, okay, well, I'm going to look at total revenue over time. So they think about metrics and dimensions. They're not like us thinking about like, okay, well, I need to go to my Stripe table and I need to like join it to users and then do whatever. Data people think in tables and business users think in metrics. So you need to give them this metrics first exploration. I don't mean giving them a list of 5,000 metrics to explore from, because that is equally not helpful. Instead, there needs to be a bunch of context added to that metrics first exploration so that they can really easily pick the right metrics and get started from the right place. And for semantic layers, they really need tight integrations with things like data catalogs so that business users can have these metrics first explorations with a bunch of context and metadata from the team and being able to curate all of this information. And so I also think that you need, from that data catalog, a system where people can actually do easy metrics exploration on Rails, not a fully fledged BI tool. I'm talking like, show me this metric over time. That's normally what I care about. And so what does this look like? Well, Minerva, which is Airbnb's internal semantic layer, has a really good example of this. So they've built a data catalog which lets people have metrics first exploration for their business users with a ton of context from the data team, like how many times it's used, whether or not it's like a data approved metric. And then you can click on these metrics and actually build these metrics exploration, which is just on Rails, queries over time grouped by something. And this gives business users a way of understanding the value of a semantic layer. So they have metrics first exploration, which is really how they're thinking about metrics. And it's a way to allow the semantic layer to be more useful for business users. Okay, we have an easy first requirement, like let's just build metrics first exploration, done. So the second requirement is that we also need tables first exploration for data users. So data people, we speak in tables. We speak in tongues sometimes too, but that's different. But we speak in tables. And if we want semantic layers to be used for more than just answering basic questions like show me a metric over time, grouped by something, then we need to be able to write SQL to interact with these tables. And when you write SQL, you're inherently interacting with tables. And so you need a way to have like a tables first approach to interacting with your semantic layer as well. And an example of this is like Cube has this with views, they call them, which is basically an association of a bunch of tables together that you can query as a single data set. But basically what I'm saying is there's metrics first for business users, but data people speak in SQL and tables, and we need to give them access to the semantic layer using SQL and tables. And then the third requirement is that there needs to be a more versatile API that's easy to integrate with. If you think about a semantic layer, it's integrating with a bunch of tools. You have notebooks and Python and R. You have BI tools that speak in SQL. You have data catalogs that speak in metadata. So it needs to be able to do all of this, and it needs to do it in a way that's really easy to integrate with. And the question here is really like, can a metrics layer be universal enough that it can be applied across the stack and integrate with all the tools that we need it to? And I think the only way to do that is by having a standard API for semantic layers that's really versatile. Okay, so we have our three requirements. We have all this great stuff that we want to do with the semantic layer. We know all the problems it solves. So I have this vision of like the integrations being the solution. And lucky for me, I'm the head of product at a semantic BI tool. So I got to actually build out some of this in practice. So I want to quickly show you a demo of what I think these sort of integrations could look like in practice. And I'm going to use a Lightdash project that's being powered by the DBT semantic layer to actually do this. Let's hope that this demo works. Okay, great. So this is a data catalog, and you can see that people are able to run metrics first exploration, click on a metric, and they have a bunch of context around the kinds of things that are important, like where it's being used, what it's joined to, how important it is for everyone else in my business. And then I can click on select the field, and I can actually query this metric over time in a very on-Rails exploration that allows for business users to really get a sense of the value of the semantic layer that the data team has spent so much time defining. So you can group it by something. This is just showing off at this point. But yeah, so there's a bunch of ways that we think that the semantic layer integration should really work. And so with this semantic layer integration, we have metrics for search, which is what we talked about. Like, this is how business users are thinking. Metadata for context, because metadata is needed for business users to actually pick the right things. And then there's on-Rails data exploration as well. And so this is a way of how dbt semantic layer has a better integration to enable people to actually use the semantic layer and see its full potential. So yeah, the question from the very start, are semantic layers just overrated hype? I might be a bit biased, but I don't think so. I think that they're here to stay. And I think that we really need to integrate semantic layers into everyday user workflows to make them truly useful. I think as data teams, we're like pretty sold, right, on this idea of centralized metric definitions that can be used across the organization. Like we're in it for semantic layers. But for semantic layers to really take off, the value needs to be felt by everyone at the business, right? And it's not just the data team that's using data to drive decision making. It's the finance team and the marketing team and the ops team. And a semantic layer really enables this data-informed decision making. But just like dropping a semantic layer into the mix and being like, look, I have a tool for you, it's great. It doesn't work. They need user experiences built around them and how they think about data. And I think for actually this semantic layer to take off, we need to build these user experiences outside of the data team. And we need to bring the semantic layer to the rest of the organization. And we can do this using integrations and improvements like I talked about today. And I think then semantic layers can really, truly reach their full potential. Yeah, and thanks so much for listening. Thank you. I hope I've triggered some opinions and maybe some questions. But yeah, you feel free to join the community, or we're also at a booth 207 doing tie-dye. Very BI related. So yeah, you can come and check that out. We also have hot sauce and cupcakes. That's an eclectic mix, but maybe not at the same time. But yeah, I don't know if I ask questions. I won't ask questions. If you ask me questions now, you don't all have to. Please don't. Yeah. I don't have a mic. I don't know how this works. Do I like go over? Do I? Does anyone? Yeah? You're projecting great. Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah?
I think like the main question that I would have is where does the line stop with data catalog and where does the line start with semantic? Because I feel like there's a lot of overlap and it's not clear to me like how to like think about the two.
Yeah, I think data catalog is kind of like a dictionary. And this is going to be a bad analogy. I can feel it already. Data catalog is like a dictionary, and semantic layer is like writing a sentence. So the way I think of a data catalog is it's a way of figuring out what's the right thing to be looking at. And then a semantic layer is a way to actually build that thing. So there's a lot of context that's in a data catalog that maybe is not in a semantic layer. But to me, a data catalog is like an entry point to a semantic layer. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. Great, my analogy worked. I'll keep that one around. Any other questions? I don't get to pick, so it's random.
Hi.
Hi.
How do you envision the semantic layer becoming universal, like you mentioned at the beginning? I guess I'm still a little confused on that because it seems like every company or every organization would need its own semantic layer. And if a new CEO came in and didn't like the current semantic layer, they would say, rip that one out and put in a new one. So how is it universal?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Universal is quite a big word. So yeah, so I think that there's a couple of ways of thinking about a universal semantic layer. The one that I think is really important is that it's like an open source standard or a standard that everyone can then use and then other tools can build on top of. There's kind of more like standalone semantic layers, which some people I guess would call universal semantic layers maybe, but that would be like a product that you'd integrate. And I don't know that you'd switch between those products very often. I think everyone would have like obviously their definitions and stuff, but you would use a product to define your semantic layer. But I think the to be truly universal in my mind, it's like we need an open source standard. We need like a standard that every semantic layer is outputting. So like an API output that everything can then integrate into. And that to me would be like what universal would look like. Does that answer your question? Yeah, okay, I felt like that. I felt that. So we can talk afterwards though. Yeah. Any other questions?
This might be a dumb question, but
Great.
going back to the original question of if you have multiple teams looking at the same metric differently, say revenue. Let's say that we have revenue for the accounting team, revenue for the finance team, and revenue for the executive team. Just talking from a more traditional data delivery method, what's stopping us from just creating a Tableau dashboard where you can just filter it and send different views to different teams, and they can just filter it differently, aggregate it, and then they would look at revenue differently. Would this not be much less effort? I suppose it'd be less automated, but especially for smaller teams, does this not do a lot of what the semantic layer is supposed to do doing?
Are you saying that you have like multiple definitions for revenue?
Yeah, let's say that people want to see revenue differently. Isn't it easier to just give them a dashboard that they can just manually add stuff and remove stuff, look at it over time,
Yeah.
and then they can have their own revenue definition,
Yeah.
and then they can share that?
Totally. If I had a data team of 100 people in my like 10-person data team, I would just get them to like build everything. But the whole idea with semantic layer is that it like 10x is your data team. So the vision in my mind is like self-service, but not just that I'm now, you know, a business person asking the data team a question and they give me a fully fledged answer. Instead, the semantic layer, the vision is that I, as a data person, can write SQL, but everyone else is good enough at data that they can then build their own queries. So I definitely think that is an option that you've suggested. I think that starts to break down when you get bigger or when you no longer have a data team that can build all of the queries and dashboards that everyone needs. And so the idea with a semantic layer is that you're giving people tables so that they can answer questions themselves that you may not have thought of in your dashboard. Does that kind of make sense? So I think the way that you could definitely build a semantic, maybe I wouldn't call it a semantic layer. You can build a dashboard that would solve a lot of the similar problems, but I don't think it scales quite the way. Yeah?
That's fair.
Okay.
Thanks.
That was a lot harder than a dumb question. I was like, oh God.
You showed how business would be able to select the metrics, how it will get linked at the back end, like what table and columns are going to be selected for that, because you will need a business analyst probably to say, okay, you know, this table, this column, or this business rule would define this metric.
Yeah, you've nailed it. That's a semantic layer. So the whole idea of the semantic layer is that your data team is defining those definitions, like what column, what table, what whatever, and then that's translating to total revenue. So it means the business user is able to click on a button, which is total revenue, and then in the background, the data team has defined all the SQL to calculate that total revenue. So instead of the business user needing to define the SQL, they're just clicking on the metric, and then the SQL that everyone's written is just reusable. Does that kind of make sense?
Okay, so you're saying that there is a predefined rules that has been given to the data team already.
Yeah.
Would have that business rule.
Yeah,
In
exactly.
fact, business doesn't need to get into like what table and column.
Exactly.
Okay.
So then it's like you define it once and then everyone else gets to use that information.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi. Yeah, what do you think is missing to define this open standard for the semantic layer? So my understanding from the presentation is that you use the implementation of DBT, right? The DBT has a specific API for its semantic layer, and you translated it in your tool. Do you think it's just gonna be, because it feels like so many companies are fighting to create their own version of semantic layer, and we don't know who's gonna win at the end. Is it gonna be like one tool like DBT who's gonna have so much, penetration in the market that it's going to become the de facto standard, or is there hope for an open source standard to emerge at some point? Or
Yeah, really great question. So we actually built Lightdash before semantic layers became a thing, and we were just waiting for the day when the open source standard would come. I think there's a lot of maturing to do in semantic layers for the open source standard to kind of become a thing. What would it take for there to be an open source standard? I think as much traction as data transformation layers with DBT, right? There just needs to be adoption. It needs to be tested across a bunch of different use cases. You need a bunch of people contributing to it. Time and also effort. Just someone needs to be this is the way to do it. And then integrations, especially as well. If you are the semantic layer with the most integrations, then kind of by default, you've built the standard. So Lightdash actually is a headless BI in that we integrate with a bunch of different semantic layers, but there's no standard. So it's quite complicated. We'd love a standard. I don't know if you're looking for another side job, but we can talk about it. But yeah, I think does that kind of answer your question? Okay, great.
Hi.
Hi.
My question is around what makes the cut in a semantic layer. So I love the idea of it, but then I can already see people asking for more and more metrics, more and more things that need to be defined, and it just goes back to ultimately I'm either adding endlessly to a semantic layer or adding endlessly to a dashboard. So how do you make those decisions?
That's a really good question. Lots of great questions. It depends, as every good answer starts with. It depends. So we started Lightdash building super governed semantic layer, right? We were you define dimensions and metrics, and that is all. And inevitably everyone was yeah, but my CEO needs data now, so that's cool, but no. And so we've slowly built in more and more flexibility. And I think that's the thing with the semantic layer is it's things that that people want, total revenue, total profit, weekly active user count. Their KPIs tend to be the things that have to exist in the semantic layer. And then a lot of tools that have semantic layers, so Lightdash, Looker, whatever, you add the option for customization or quick metric building. So for example, in Lightdash, you have your columns, which are dimensions, and you can do a custom metric, which quickly sums something or averages. So it means your data team isn't sat there creating metrics for everything. But my rule of thumb is if you're using it in your KPI dashboard, it should be in the semantic layer defined by the data team and governed and all those things. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay, cool.
We probably have time for one more.
Yeah. Sure.
Hi,
Hi.
it's really interesting. Full disclosure, I work in the MarTech industry, which is a disaster of lack of semantic standards. Do you find that, are there industries that this works better in, or verticals that it works better in? I don't know if you, CPG data is just perpetually a mess.
Yeah.
Do you see this being applied there, or what are your thoughts on that?
What's CPG? Sorry.
Oh, sorry. So that's consumer product data.
Okay.
So for instance, UPC codes
Okay.
and product, yeah. Okay.
Sorry,
And
I'm not good at acronyms.
And the stuff changes and all of that. Yeah.
Yeah. So semantic layers tend to work really well when you're just starting to build a data stack because you're starting from scratch. But I think also in the verticals, it tends to be things that are very well, not governed, but it's controlled. So finance, insurance, those are people who tend to need a semantic layer in terms of requirements legally to be able to define how their metrics are being calculated and things like that. So the adoption we found has been big with those companies, but I think anyone can use a semantic layer. The recommendation we have at the start is don't try to do all of everything at once. Focus on the KPIs or just one KPI. Right. And then you're look, we have one KPI that we know is right. Not that they're ever wrong, but They're just different. And so, yeah, it's being able to like start and kind of show people how valuable it is in one part of the business and then expanding it. And I think it's vertical agnostic, but yeah.
But maybe we could sell it in via our audit and governance
Yeah,
department.
exactly. Accounting, like finance team, they love this. They're like, semantic layer. Yes. Yeah, great. I think that's all the time that we have, maybe. Yeah, okay. Thanks.